Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dalton Collective Weekly Hangout. So today, just have a few things I wanted to go over. But actually, Rapsif, do you have an update for us? Because last week we were on hold.
I do have an update. I mad tweeted at LegalZoom to yell at them, and as a result, I'm assuming that's the only reason this happened. But we are now officially a company. I am able
Sweet.
to download the files. We have a registered agent in the state of Delaware. We even got the SIG in the front of our name. So isn't
Nice.
that awesome?
We kept
Very
it
nice.
all. That is particularly awesome. And something like happened this last week that I wanted to talk about, specifically with regards to incorporation. So I had a chat with some folks from Autonomous, spelled with an OTONOMOS, which is sort of like seems like a legal Zoom for some of these crypto projects where they will, for a fee, incorporate different legal entities. And but one particular interesting thing that I saw from one of their services is they put out this blog post about a legal structure that they think would work well for community-driven projects in general, which was you set up a trust, and the trust is a community-led organization that's primarily concerned with either growing the protocol or sort of higher level goals of whatever the company is trying to do. Maybe not companies the right word, but a trust. And then everybody who's a part of that trust is a direct beneficiary of whatever the protocol is doing. And then the trust will then own an LLC. That LLC will be designated as the sort of operations role of the trust. And it will have like a traditional structure, like a president and a board of directors or anything else like that a traditional LLC might have. But then the trust holds sort of accountability over the LLC. So if the trust believes that the LLC is not working in the best interest of the trust, they can fire them and get a new one. So in that way, the trust or the LLC is accountable, but the LLC is not the trust itself. So they're acting autonomously, doing things on behalf of the trust and fully owned by the trust. And I posted the actual clip in the Dalten Collective where it sort of gets to the meat of this argument, plus a little sort of diagram on how these things sort of interoperate. And I thought that might be an interesting way to, because we're already an LLC, if at some point we think that Dalton's at a particular size and we want it to have sort of like this sort of structure where we have a layer of almost fully decentralized entities, this trust, and then sort of a more traditional LLC, which we now have, that's a potential way we could move forward. So yeah, Rapsif, what do you think of that sort of pattern? Is that something you've heard of before?
I'm trying to see exactly what the ID network funding. I think I understand the concept. I'm looking at your diagram. I'm just trying to read the sideways text. Yeah, I think I understand what's going on here. And I think what's the benefit in their eyes of having this secondary entity rather than just holding all of the assets and things at the level of the network contract?
Well, they kind of go through like the reasons why you might do this, but it's sort of like getting the best of both worlds of fully decentralized community building and like that sort of thing, but also just getting stuff done. Like you could sort of merge those two things together. So the community is the beneficiary of the larger rewards. They're doing a lot of the sort of marketing or evangelism of whatever it is that people are doing, maybe even doing a lot of the building themselves. But then like the legal structure that needs to be in place in order to like engage in any sort of contract work or paying employees or managing treasuries or bank accounts or any of that other stuff would then be a subsidiary of this thing, the trust, that is.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, lots of trusts have ownership in businesses, so that makes total sense. And then I get so the contract at the top, or whatever you would call it, the like agreement between like cryptographic addresses or whatever, that's just the beneficiary of the trust is the
Correct.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, that makes a lot of sense.
let's say all the members of Dalten would be like if there was a Dalten token that eventually represented ownership of like the economic protocol that we're trying to sort of bootstrap here, whatever that sort of mix looks like, that's how the trust would be the thing that has those assets, and the individual trustees or the beneficiaries would have some split of all of that. Is
Yeah.
what I'm kind of guessing.
Well, and you wouldn't have to be a trust you wouldn't have to be a participant in the trust in the sense of being a trustee to own a token and receive benefits from it.
Just a beneficiary, right?
Yeah.
Trustee is actually something else.
No, that's cool.
Yeah. So that could be something we can grow into, right? Because it's something that tacks on to something that we already have.
Okay. One question about that. We wouldn't want the token holders to be equally compensated, right?
Correct. Right.
So would it be apportioned by the number of tokens that you held, or how did they talk about that at all? The type of token, maybe?
No, but I think so. In terms of the trust, you could think of it as just sort of a proxy for smart contract as well. So in this case, let's consider at least one DAO that I'm familiar with that might be analogous to something like we're trying to do that I have some input on. So this is like the Moloch DAO, which is so the Moloch DAO V2 smart contracts. That is what runs a Metacartel Ventures. So that's a for-profit DAO, decentralized, autonomous, whatever, right? But the way it works is you contribute tokens like Ether, and then you get DAO shares in proportion to however much Ether you're putting in. Well, it's actually like a ratio. Like it started out at one Ether was 10 DAO tokens. And then it's like the amount of DAO tokens is going down. You're getting less DAO tokens for your Ether as time goes on. But that's just like a rate that's set by the group. But however much you get in, that's how much you have. And that is when you redeem them for whatever tokens the group has in proportion to your ownership. Right? Now that's not necessarily the pattern that we would want to do, but there would be something like that, where like the group would have collective assets under management or just ownership, and you would have some right to a portion of that based on how much you've put in, plus either maybe some direct compensation. So I really do see it as two things. Again, cash flow and assets. Cash flow and assets. So if you take a contract as part of a team in Dalten, you're going to get like 50% in just stable coins, whatever your flavor of stable coins are for your cash flow needs. Then you get a portion in Dalten tokens, which would be a share of everything that Dalten has, which if you did this is like on your team and you got paid in stable coins, and let's say we're doing a contract for some other blockchain and they had their own native token and we got some of those tokens, that would go into the treasury, and that would be part of the thing that you would have a claim on. And maybe we have certain regulations or times of year in which you can draw from the treasury for your own needs. Right. But it's not like we want to prevent a bank run, because then.
Right. I was just going to say, you don't want to run on the bank though. So yeah.
Right. And then we could do, but potentially then there would be some services that maybe we have treasury management, where we do like really vanilla stuff. Like if we had a bunch of DAI and we wanted to, or Ether, you can lend that out at an interest rate, a small interest rate, like not like DeFi, stuff, but like sane, normal sort of financial protocols, and have some small return on the treasury. You could have the LLC manage that,
right,
and sort of just do that as a function. And then if the trustee, or not, if the trust ever decides that the LLC is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, they get booted. So in that way, there's accountability.
When we get enough assets, do you want to do like a Bernie Madoff thing with DeFi and like get a bunch of money and then split so that everyone else is screwed? Or is that?
Unfortunately, you can't do that with DeFi because it's all transparent.
Okay. Okay. All right. No, that makes sense.
You can
Okay.
certainly run a Ponzi scheme, but everybody will know that it's a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
All
yeah,
right.
but I think that makes sense to me. Is like really easy to understand. Treasury management would be a potential way that we can continue to grow assets in relation to the whole group. That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm fairly risk averse, and DeFi is certainly risk on as opposed to like risk off, right? But
Mm-hmm.
there's certainly still way more yield in crypto in general than in the traditional financial markets. So even if we just like bought Bitcoin, like that's probably going to have more yield over the long term than like bonds or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll just buy Bitcoin. How about that?
Or Ether.
Or Ether. Yeah, I like both. I
Yeah,
use both.
we should diversify those assets. But
Whoa.
my cat died. I do think that we will see some real problems with fiat currency in the next couple of years. So if we can start holding our assets and maybe even allow, this is risky. I wonder how much we should allow people to bank with Dalten. You know what I mean? To put money into Dalten as some sort of
Management.
Yeah.
I thought about that, and because it's come up in relation to Metacartel, of which I'm also a member. So like some of the members are founders. Actually, a lot of the members are founders of other projects, and they've got all of these founder tokens. And the idea was, well, look, I trust a lot of these people here and their sort of instincts on how to deploy these tokens to get yield. If we had a system where there was proper insurance and low risk, like then they would feel comfortable putting quite a lot of their founder tokens in under management, which would then help the group in general because it increases their asset under management, which gives you a buffer for accreditation, that kind of thing. But pretty safe investments like, basic loans or something like that. Now I could see that possibly could happen, but we'd have to have a pretty good reason why we're qualified to do that. Plus, I don't know what the requirements would be to offer those sorts of services. The requirements might be exorbitant, like especially just the insurance, because I wouldn't want to do anything like that without proper insurance and regulation and licensing and whatever that takes, right?
Right.
So maybe, probably not.
Yeah, there's definitely some things about like money exchangers who and if you're taking them and converting them to some other type of token for payback or something like that, that could be potentially problematic. That's a very good point. I was only looking at it from the perspective of growing the endowment of the organization to better be able to do things while also allowing people a hedge against uncertainty in fiat currency. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. But I mean, there might be other things we can do with that sort of capital. Like you might imagine people lending us capital in order to find other people, or let's say maybe not lending it, but like maybe people give us money in order for us to give it out as grants, something like that, and we have a small fee for that. So, and the reason why would anybody want to do that? Well, if let's say for Urbit specifically, and some Galaxy holder who really thinks long term and has some capital that they're willing to put into the system. Hey, it's Ted.
Hi.
So they could potentially give it to Dalten, and Dalten could find those projects, make those grants that would eventually yield benefit to the whole ecosystem, and then increase the value of the assets overall.
Okay.
So that could be a potential thing we could do.
I like that idea.
Yeah. Ted, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, sure. Sorry I'm late.
No worries. We were just talking about Dalten treasury management and potentially using a trust as a layer on top of the Dalten Collective, which is now a legal entity. It's an LLC in Delaware. As a potential way of managing, sort of getting the best of decentralization plus sort of centralized legal entity, in this case Dalten Collective LLC, to do management things. And if the trust lost faith in that legal entity, they could boot them out and then get a new one, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Right. So the topic at hand, which has been bubbling up in many different places on Urbit, is gas prices are too damn high. Plus a lot of distrust and sort of, or at least skepticism. Let me put it that way. Skepticism in what's going on in the Ether world right now and the reason why gas prices are so high. That's probably not the direct issue that we're talking about right now, but we do know that it does have an impact on us in Urbit because it's very expensive now to boot a star or boot a planet.
Yeah.
So we've been talking more earnestly about things we might be able to do. There are a few somewhat straightforward paths, which is to say there's a side chain of Ethereum that accepts Solidity code that could potentially service our needs, but has some other trade-offs in terms of added complexity and a bridge that you would need to move your assets over, so you'd still have some pain moving and a bunch of other things, and potentially still could wind up in the same place again where there are still high fees if it gets too popular. So that's XDAI. That's one possible solution. Another possible solution, which was something
sidechain.
Yeah, XDAI has been around for years, and it's an existing sister chain of Ethereum and works pretty well.
I knew about that, actually.
Yeah, but that's one reason. I mean, these are just multiple options. But the reason I asked you here specifically was to talk about your thoughts on doing something internally, where there's some debate about how much, let's call it Byzantine fault tolerance, is required for asset management or property right management, asset registry. What that might look like, how might galaxies or stars be involved, all those questions about an internal solution, and some of the thoughts that you've had recently about this.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of people about it and thinking about it and gathering different approaches that we could take. No decisions have been made. This is not financial advice. And there are a lot of different dimensions to consider here. So there are, a number of solutions have been proposed. Various Ethereum sidechain ideas. I am skeptical of those because I'm just like not smart enough to do it right. And I don't know if anybody is. And I think this is a serious problem with anything like that, right? The basic semantics of the rules of how these things update and how they work. Like I do think, the more transparent and sort of easy to prove correct those rules are, the better off the system is in a number of ways. I mean, sidechains, I do understand the overall idea, but I'm skeptical in general for a number of reasons. The way I prefer to think about this question is sort of working forward from right now and working backward from infinity, right? So forward from right now is like, all right, we have this immediate problem with Ethereum. Can we solve this immediate problem of the high gas prices? Ideally involving as little engineering work as possible and as little risk as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as little lead time as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are various solutions for that. And then thinking backward from infinity means thinking like, all right, it's the year 7,500, whatever, right? How does Urbit maintain its PKI?
Yeah.
Does it use Ethereum? I don't think anybody would answer that question in the affirmative, honestly. I don't know anybody involved, even like all the like Ethereum people who I know who work in Ethereum, like especially those people, I think would say like, no, it's going to be something else. Now, maybe not. I mean, we don't know the future. But I think there's an easy sort of shelling point for answering that question of how does Urbit maintain its PKI, which is Urbit maintains its own PKI, right? Go a few thousand years into the future and like, yeah, Urbit's probably maintaining its own PKI. Now, how does it maintain its own PKI and what are the properties of that PKI? That's not obvious. And it's not totally obvious that this is the only answer to the question, right? Because, and the reason for that, well, there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that, in general, there could be some sort of safety from being like one part of a larger ecosystem where nobody wants to break the whole ecosystem by trying to break just Urbit. It's a little bit hand wavy, actually, right? Like, how does that translate sort of into technical meat? But I think it does, I think, in a couple ways. And also, there's the other point, which is that Urbit almost certainly needs a globally consistent, totally ordered sequence of PKI updates, right? State replication with Byzantine fault tolerance. Right? Like Urbit needs that. Almost certainly. Now, there are a couple of designs you could throw out there that don't have that and have almost that are interesting. But it seems like it's probably harder to get those kinds of designs to work. And they're like more, research oriented, and you lose a lot of nice properties. And one of the nice properties that you might lose from that, I mean, it depends on how well it actually solves the double, what in Bitcoin is called the double spend problem. And for us is basically the double sell problem, right? So the Urbit equivalent of Bitcoin's double spend problem is, can I sell my Urbit address to two different keys and make twice the money? So, this is one of the big things that we rely on Ethereum to do for us, is to prevent this, because they have, a proof of work system that prevents this. I mean, it prevents it asymptotically. You have to wait, right? Like, it's only ever an imperfect solution, but it's one that works pretty well in practice. You wait a little while and it's fine, as far as we can tell. So right now, we rely on Ethereum's proof of work to get this property. But there are other ways of getting this property. Several other ways. So, there are other blockchains, Bitcoin, various sort of proof of stake systems, which are less well proven out, probably, but have, should at least theoretically lower costs involved in running them. And then there's the solution that I'm gravitating toward at the moment, which is to say that the galaxies, which already are, responsible for a lot of things in Urbit. I mean, they're responsible for, technically they're responsible for routing, right? For being the root nodes that are always on. So they're always available. They have to be always available or they're going to lose money. They will in the future once the sort of galaxy, star, planet system is running at the scale at which you'd actually care about these things. Then galaxies have to provide service to their stars in the form of routing to the stars. They have to maintain a routing table, say where the stars are. They're the root nodes. And they may also need to be able to forward packets for stars. There's some debate as to whether only stars will actually need to do NAT punch through and whatnot. I suspect we'll go that route, and like stars would just be required to have public IPs and not be behind a NAT. I think that's a reasonable requirement. Simplifies the system, lessens the burden on the galaxies, which in turn lessens the amount of reliance on the galaxies. But the other thing the galaxies are responsible for is for being the coordination point for decisions that require something other than automated governance, right? The idea is that, like, in general, whatever systems we have on the Urbit network for maintaining the PKI, for doing routing, for, software distribution, things like that, all kinds of stuff, like most of it's automated, right? Most of it's just, we're running computer programs, you just make sure they keep running and they do what they're supposed to do. But sometimes things happen that nobody could predict, and it's unclear what should be done about it, right? And so in that case, then basically something where the technology doesn't solve the problem for you. And largely in reaction to the problems that Ethereum had with the DAO hack a few years ago, where they didn't have anything official for this, in my understanding. I'm not an expert in this, in what happened there, but my understanding of it is that there wasn't an official sort of governance structure for the Ethereum network. And so this, really bad event happened. A lot of money got siphoned out maliciously. And there were two different sort of theoretical approaches or practical approaches to what should be done, right? One was, oh, well, code is law, so let's go with the code is law approach. That became Ethereum Classic. The other one was, that sucks. Let's just all get together and say that didn't happen. And my impression is that it was sort of Vitalik leading that charge in essentially de facto manner. And that's what we call Ethereum today. But that this was very divisive, and Ethereum lost some steam from this. It lost some momentum, lost some money, right, by forking the network, losing some network effect. And generally, you don't want to fork, right? Forking sucks. So the idea was, and also it wasn't clear that it would sort of split that evenly or even continue to function at all, right? Maybe that's one of the better things that could have happened in a situation like that. So the idea behind having some sort of, minimal formal governance structure for Urbit is that in the case where something unexpected and calamitous happens, there's at least a group of people who have been on the network who have had to develop trust, right? They've had to develop reputation. They've had to actually provide services for a long period of time and be trustworthy. And so that's not going to be perfect, but okay, at least that's like the first group of people that the whole network will look to and say, all right, well, what do you guys think? Right? As a collective body, as a Senate with bylaws and, committees and whatnot, and ideally, publishing a lot of, publicly available documents and agreeing on procedures and code and whatnot, right? Like having all these systems in place so that, okay, something goes wrong, it's like, well, ask the, Byzantine fault subcommittee of the blah, 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 of the whatever, right? And, we're not going to specify up front how all that stuff will work. Just a little bit of minimal, constitution and voting system so that the galaxies can create consensus among themselves about what to do. So that's the overall structure of the Urbit network, right? And the governance structure of the Urbit network. And it's very minimal, right? Like how each galaxy interacts with its stars, how each star interacts with its planets, totally up to them. The Dalten collective is a collectively owned and managed star. Most stars aren't like that at the moment, but whatever, anybody can do whatever they want, and, up to, the system has no sort of interdiction powers on this at the moment. To prevent people from organizing, like if you wanted to have all the stars underneath the galaxy vote and that galaxy, just does whatever its stars vote for it to do, that's a perfectly reasonable arrangement. I expect probably a few of them will work that way. Some of them probably be more like a, family business. Right, so there's this big range, and the idea is that there should actually be sort of competitive arrangements here, and whichever kind of provides the best service and best sort of long-term, social arrangements and technical arrangements, those should do well and be, thriving places. And they don't have to do very much usually, right? Basically, they just have to stay online, route packets the way they're supposed to, and don't do anything dumb. But some things are complicated, and anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but basically, I think one way to approach this issue is to say, well, the galaxies should also maintain consensus about the status of the PKI. And one way you could do this is that they could do a leader election, just like a normal consensus algorithm, Byzantine fault tolerant or not, right? Like they usually involve, you pick one of the nodes to temporarily, be for at least a while, right? Just receive requests, stamp and order each one, sign them, right? And establish that globally consistent ordering. And so the consensus mechanism is, well, everybody agrees that we're going to just listen to that guy for a while, until that privilege is revoked. It's the galaxies that would decide whether that privilege is revoked. So it's basically like they choose some galaxy, they choose Nus or whatever. They say, okay, Nus is the orderer, right? Responsible for ordering the transactions. Broadcast that out to all the galaxies. All the galaxies are responsible for maintaining a full mirror of the entire PKI, which never gets that big on Urbit, right? If there are 4 billion people on Urbit, the network is full. Then Philip did the math on this. It's something like 400 gigabytes to store the current state. Now, you don't want everybody to have to do that, but requiring a galaxy to do it is fine. So right now it's much smaller. It's like a few megabytes, I believe.
So it sounds like what you're describing is something like proof of authority.
Yeah, it's related. It's similar to that. It's basically like a very, it's sort of like, what's the dumbest system you can imagine to do this? Right? That's sort of how I'm approaching it. Is like, and that actually guarantees Byzantine fault tolerance, which you can do here. You can guarantee Byzantine fault tolerance among the galaxies. And the number, so let's say that you have, now, there are details of like how much Byzantine fault tolerance you want for different pieces of it. And so, you might say, like one thing you could do is just say, Zod proposes a transaction, sends it to 128 other galaxies. And when they said, or it sends it to all the galaxies, but once it receives 128 signatures from other galaxies, Zod signs that up to seal it. You have 129, simple majority. And okay, now that's done, sealed, send it to, broadcast it out. If just Zod is Byzantine, like, so if any other galaxy is Byzantine, they can't really do anything in this scheme. They can just not sign it. If Zod is Byzantine, then actually it can't really do anything either, other than stop producing transactions or be slow about it, or censor transactions, which is a different problem that I'll get into. And that's probably the biggest problem with this scheme is transaction censorship. But that's actually a very different, or it's a very complex issue, I think. And the more I think about it, the more I think that transaction censorship is sort of fundamentally unsolvable, basically, in any system, including Ethereum. But you can mitigate it to varying degrees in different ways, and there are different properties that you might have about it. So I think that is sort of the first sort of big problem that you would face, at least theoretically, with a system like this. But basically, other than just sort of slowing down or selectively ignoring transactions, just Zod on its own wouldn't really be able to do a traditional Byzantine fault in the sense of sending two different transactions to two different partitions of the galaxies, right? Because the math doesn't work out. Now, if you had, like, you wouldn't be able to get to a majority. You can't get to 229 majorities with just one node voting, with just one node being Byzantine. With two nodes Byzantine, I believe you can get then 129, so Zod and somebody else. Then, if none of the galaxies talk to each other in the meantime before signing this thing, right? If there was zero gossip, then those two nodes, if they could perfectly partition the network, then they could influence the vote if it was a split vote, basically. Or like they could split the network, get two different states to exist if nobody talked to each other. And really like in practice, every galaxy should like wait until a few other galaxies have heard this and confirm before sending it back to Zod. And that makes it very difficult to do a Byzantine fault attack. I mean, if you go back to Lamport's original paper about this, once you have, well, he's measuring something a little bit different. This idea of was it interactive consensus or interactive? I think it's called interactive consensus is what they call it. But basically, that's actually tracking one state from from each of the different nodes, not just one state overall. So the idea is that each of the galaxies would have some private state, and everybody has to know everybody else's private state. It's actually a harder problem than what we're trying to solve. But even if it's that problem, then once you have cryptographic signatures, it's easier to get Byzantine fault tolerance. But like the requirement isn't as high in terms of number of nodes that are trustworthy. But in this case, basically the math is that you need, like, for a simple majority vote, which most transactions would be, except for things like updates to the PKI itself, and maybe maybe the leader election, right, switching from Zod to some other galaxy, right, or whoever is like as the orderer, right. Maybe you would want a 2/3 vote for that, but you really want 2/3 plus n/2 galaxies to in case there really are. If you really want to protect against Byzantine faults, then you want n/2. In this case, because that's how many you need to like perfectly partition the network. You'd also want to have or alternatively, you have a sort of informal arrangement where the galaxies have a gossip network and they make sure that they've all heard this transaction from 5 other galaxies before they sign it and send it to Zod. So I think that in practice, you probably really want for all the transactions, I think for most transactions, basically, there's not much. You don't necessarily need all the galaxies to vote on it, and you just have Zod propagate it out, right? Sign it, number it, propagate it out to the other galaxies. Everybody mirrors it. They all validate the signatures, validate the rules, right? And the code that they'll use to validate the rules is public. You ideally want a separate implementation that's not in Urbit that everybody checks against. You could also do checkpointing to the Bitcoin chain, post hashes there in case there's any kind of rollback that everybody wants to do. That's a separate piece, right? These are all kind of separate pieces that you could imagine launching this thing without those separate pieces at the very beginning. You might not want to, right? But they're sort of like, they're just kind of somewhat optional sort of safety improvements that don't affect the core semantics, that's part of what I like about this design is that, it's like, how does this thing work? It's like, well, you send a request to Zod. Zod runs the rules, the same rules that everybody runs. It follows the rules, numbers it, stamps it, sends it out to all the galaxies. All the galaxies store it, 256, individual replicas of the whole state. You can store the whole state. You don't have to shard it. You don't have to do weird Merkleization where you were like part of it's in some sidechain somewhere. And then
could you even do like a subset, like instead of just having one root node, Zod, like some 3 of 5, so you don't have a single point of failure there? Would that be, how much overhead might that increase though? Is that the question?
Well, then you'd have to have them agree on, the ordering that they're going to use. So I think basically, like one way you could think about doing this is, so like let's say you're worried about Zod. There are a few things you might worry about here, right? Like one is Zod's availability.
Yep.
Another is Zod's data integrity, and another is Zod being Byzantine, right? Mm-hmm. Which essentially means being malicious.
Right.
Maybe certain forms of of lack of data integrity can cause Byzantine faults as well. But it's much less likely when signatures are involved. It could still happen. Although in practice, Urbit's single-threaded, you got signatures. you're probably not going to have a Byzantine fault unless you try. But in any case, any of those things sort of could happen. And I think that like if Zod loses data, then basically it's not able to process transactions anymore, right? And so that will basically show up as a because it won't be able to include the hash of the previous one and the next one, for example, if it actually loses that piece of data. But the way, so now if it just sort of loses part of the state for some reason, it's like, okay, well then that's sort of a replication failure where, okay, one of the 256 galaxy nodes doesn't have the full state. So that's basically a data availability problem. You still get 255 other nodes running if all the galaxies are online. That's not too bad. You probably also want to run a few other mirrors of that state in different places and have an official, checkpointing of the hash onto some other chain, Bitcoin or Ethereum, periodically, right? Just as a way of sort of writing that down. But basically, I think that so then there's the sort of like, what if Zod gets slow, or what if it stops processing transactions at all? And then I think it's like, well, then the galaxies get together and they start talking to each other and say, time to replace Zod. Go talk to Zod. Hey, Zod, like, are you just having an outage or what's going on? And if Zod's like, yeah, I had an outage. Sorry, I'm back up now. Okay, fine. You can keep doing it. But, if that happens a lot, they say, you know what, Zod, you're not doing a good job. We're going to switch to Nuss. Nuss is now going to be the orderer for now. So, that's an in-ban. So then they all vote on that. Maybe you need a 2/3 vote. Maybe it's just half. That could be part of the contract, part of the sort of bylaws that they have. That can actually be sort of cryptographically in the contract, in the sense of, these things will be running in Urbit. And so it would run as a Hoon app, right? And it would run as an app inside of Arvo. You'd say, here's the new source code for that app, the whole desk, right? And so they would agree on the source code. You'd actually send the whole source code in band, not just the hash of it. I think you'd actually send it in band, so that the full state, right? If you're storing the PKI, you're not just storing, there are no other dependencies. Like, you're storing every single piece of data that you would possibly need to like construct this state and have it be queryable. It's not that much data, right? Like, it's not gonna be that much code in this thing. Now you might have other apps around it that do, statistics and monitoring and secondary indexes and all this sort of stuff. But you want to keep those out of the spec, keep the spec clean. That's not too hard to build, actually. Just in Hoon, that's not a research problem, right? That's like just have to write some code, not that much code. And then, but yeah, so in band, so like, Zod gets slow or shuts down. Then in band, it's sort of just like it is right now on Ethereum, where like, one of the transactions that can happen on Ethereum is upgrading the contract to a new contract, right? Upgrading the constitution to a new constitution. And I think it's a 2/3 majority vote for that required right now. Something like that is, I think, about reasonable. So yeah, they do the same thing, and they could do the same thing to either change the code or just switch who's the leader.
And you could even sort of have some heuristics for that. So let's say, if Zod falls behind more than n number of transactions, which they're all receiving, new updates, and they all can agree that, it's around this number. That's the threshold at which we might poke Zod, say, hey, are you alive, out of ban, so to speak, or might elect a new leader. And internally, like the internal state of the public key infrastructure might say, well, we haven't had a last finalized state in 25 transactions, but I'm okay with that because I'm fine. That's okay.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't be able to measure it in terms of transactions in this case, right? Because you just wouldn't be hearing any new transactions. Now, you could say like,
or whatever the.
Yeah, and right. Zod might this might also be done by block, not just by transaction, as an optimization. Probably don't need to for now, honestly, but yeah, you could paginate them into blocks the way that everybody else does, right? Probably a good idea long term, but yeah, I think but yeah, you don't want to think of it in terms of transactions, because especially at the beginning, because yeah, I think actually the volume of transactions isn't constant, right? Like
No.
there aren't that many people on the network. Like you'll get a few transactions here and there, but it's not like so like I don't think that Zod needs to make like empty blocks basically and push those out.
No.
But basically it could be that if Zod seems to not be responding to messages, or or the galaxies themselves have requests that they want to send to Zod, and Zod hasn't responded to that, and they've got a queue and they're waiting for some amount of time, right? Like various heuristics. Then yeah, like I think that if the heuristics start to get bad, then yeah, like the galaxy should get paged essentially, and say like, hey, who's the backup? Who do we plan as the backup for if Zod goes down informally? Like, yeah, let's just go switch to that guy. Now you could imagine trying to build that informally into the protocol, right? There are plenty of things that do have formal leader elections as part of the protocol, formal sort of timeout requirements. This has been done. There's precedent for it.
Yep.
There's a lot of variation in how that's done. And I'm just not sure we need it, especially at this stage. I think that's something that could be added to the protocol, but it's the more things we automate, the more moving parts the system has. Now, conversely, the more things we automate, the less Galaxy owners have to think about it, and the more stuff just sort of runs smoothly automatically, which is good. But you have to make sure that it actually does run smoothly and doesn't induce new failure modes, new forms of risk. There are things like I don't know too much about how Tendermint works, but I believe it has something for this, some sort of, and I know the what was it, the Libra people had some kind of they at least had plans for using verifiable random functions to figure out who would be the next leader.
Yeah.
I don't know if they've actually gone and implemented those plans, or if those have been tested and bulletproofed. Right. Like my kind of attitude about this, and we'll see how this develops as we think about it more. My attitude might change, but at the moment, I'm thinking, is there a way that we can get the hard properties that we need and do an okay job in the soft properties with minimal complexity, right? Minimal moving parts, minimal sort of dynamics, right? Like proof of stake, there are all these, there's staking, there's delegated staking, there's like, there's a lot of stuff flying around, it's like, ideally we would be in a situation where we don't need to be kind of trying to do forensics on a system that's more complex than anybody can hold in their head. And so that's why I'm leaning towards this idea of like, all right, let's get the hard properties that we need. Like we do need Byzantine consensus. We do need a globally consistent ordering of events, right? Like that's clear. And because we need to be able to interop with other markets. We need to be able to have like an auditable, verifiable history and state, and nobody needs to be able to double spend, right? Like you shouldn't be able to double sell like at all. It just shouldn't work. Shouldn't have to recover from it. I mean, interestingly, I think that this arrangement that I've described, as dumb as it is, by the way, there's a piece of it I didn't describe, which is if Zod's the orderer and it tries to sell some of its own assets, then it needs a majority for that, right? Like,
yeah,
because otherwise it would be able to double sell, right? So nobody, including the orderer, should be able to double sell. And then it's like, all right, those are basically the hard properties that we need. There are other soft properties that we want. And can we build a system that's like very small, very manageable, very clear what's going on, that solves all the hard requirements, and then add pieces to it later to satisfy some of the softer requirements, right? So here's an example of a softer requirement is like, well, if something goes wrong with this, it would be nice not to have to like, reach really far back into the past and try to like rerun from there. It'd be nice to have checkpoints that are logged somewhere, right? So like, yeah, should log some checkpoints, right? Probably maybe in a few different ways. Stick them on Amazon S3, stick hashes of them on the Bitcoin chain, whatever, right? Like,
IPFS, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe do a few of them, right? Just like something that's sort of like, okay, it would be nice to have this, right? It's a sort of an extra bulwark against various kinds of failure, right? Other ways of like mitigating risk. And then, yeah, and like, can we add those sort of incrementally, right? Can we build those out as we need? We don't actually know what all, like, my big argument about this is like, and we'll see, because this is also something I'm willing to be wrong about this. I'm willing to discover I'm wrong about this. But my overall attitude at the moment is, right now we have a system with a couple thousand nodes running, something like that. 500 on a good day, right? But like total of a few thousand. Mm-hmm. Let's plan for things going well. Things go well, that'll go up to a few billion. The problems that we're going to have, and we have a few billion people in the network, I don't think they're going to look much like the problems that we have with a few hundred people in the network.
Probably true.
And so we can kind of, we can add as many dimensions to this chess game as we want, but they might not be the right dimensions. And so my inclination is to say, like, let's do something that's solid, defensible, makes sense. You can do the math like in a few minutes and know that it actually works. And then, yeah, when we need to, like, if it turns out that, that like maybe the maybe leader election like happens too often, Zod goes down a lot, and we're like, you know what, we should automate that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's automate the leader election. How do we do that? All right, well, there's a lot of precedent for that, right? We can add that. So that's a lot of how I'm thinking about this. This solution needs to be vetted. Like, I don't have buy-in on this from everybody on the team. This is how I'm thinking about it personally. And then as when it comes to a short-term measure, right? So this is all long-term too. This is like, I'm mostly thinking about where do we want to be eventually.
Yeah.
And that only has some amount of bearing on what we should do right now to solve the problem that we have at the moment. And what we should do right now, well, yeah, there are various sidechain options. I find those distasteful, but maybe they're the right thing to do. I don't know. But the other option that I find attractive, that I've been thinking through the past day or two, talking to people about a little bit, as a short-term idea is would be like, the big problem is the transaction costs, but which are, I don't know, what, 50 or $100 depending on how fast you want them to go through.
Pretty much, yeah.
Going up and down as we speak, right? But the probably mostly up, unfortunately. But that's a really big problem for selling a planet, right? Because most of the time these days, people mostly just want to give away a planet. I think or I don't know, maybe it's not the most common. It's common, right?
Yeah.
But certainly, like, the price of a planet doesn't do well. Like, it doesn't match up with that level of transaction cost. However, the price of a star, okay, if you want to pay $50 to transfer a star, that's not great, but I mean, it's comparable to what, like a stock trade, right? Like, people used to paying somewhere around that percentage. It's not great, but it's not catastrophically bad, right? And then for selling a galaxy, which there's not really any volume in that at the moment, but given the value of a galaxy, if somebody wants to sell that for $100, that's no problem at all.
Yeah.
So it's really just for planets where this is a really bad problem. So one thing we could imagine doing is taking this system of that I've been describing, of having Zod order transactions, galaxies all vote when they need to, all the galaxies maintain a full mirror of the PKI. we could take that idea, but instead of using requests from inside of Urbit to update the state of galaxy and stars, Zod would not take in requests from Urbit about galaxies and stars, and instead it would listen to the Ethereum chain. And so basically, we'd take the planets, we'd freeze the planets, on the Ethereum chain. Say Ethereum's not storing this anymore, not in an up-to-date way. We switch that over into storing that inside of Urbit in basically the same way that I've described, right? Moon app, an orderer, all these mirrors, votes when needed, and you probably want still all the same kind of security features of like, a second parallel implementation that's not an Urbit that you can check against, right? In case Urbit gets owned. Periodic checkpointing, all this stuff, right? So do that, but just for planets, basically. But or the other way of thinking about that is it's still sort of mostly self-hosted, but the source of truth for galaxies and stars is Ethereum. And so then, if you want to make a change to the source of truth, you have to make a change on Ethereum. So then it's like, okay, that I think that would solve the immediate problem. And the other thing is that it might give us some experience with, testing out, like, all right, what is it like to run a PKI ourselves? Maybe we find out that this is really not so great when we try it, and find like, oh, actually there's this other problem we didn't think of, and we shouldn't, like, oh, good thing we didn't switch over all the stars and galaxies to that immediately. Or we might find the opposite, which is, oh wow, it's really easy to like do stuff with planets. It happens immediately, and actually this seems pretty secure, like, right? I mean, but basically, like, I think that, so in addition to, I think, solving the immediate problem in what I currently believe to be a reasonable way, and again, this needs more vetting. I'm not done thinking about this. And I'm not the only one thinking about it. I'm talking to a lot of people about it. But I think that would be a reasonable stepping stone toward the sort of, the eventual Platonic ideal of Urbit hosting all its own stuff and not also taking on all of the risk that Ethereum has, or taking on all of the risk that, whatever external blockchain we rely on. You can kind of look at that two different ways. One is, we look on relying on, you can look at relying on an external blockchain two different ways. One is, well, like, they're providing all this extra reliability for us, de-risking all this stuff that we would have to de-risk ourselves by providing Byzantine consensus and what, and blah, blah, blah. The other way of looking at it is, now Urbit as a system is existentially dependent on the functionality of some other system that we don't have control over, right? We meaning the galaxies, Talon, the Urbit Foundation, the planets, right? Like, if Ethereum goes down the tubes, like, we can't fix it. And so there's so I think long-term, I think that's the reason I think that sort of the shelling point for long-term where this needs to live inside of Urbit. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult problem. And so I think doing this in such a way where we experiment with that, ideally in a way that's like very unlikely, where we like really prove it out. So like, we make sure that, no matter if any piece of it breaks, like nobody's going to lose their plan.
Yeah. And under that sort of experimental short-term scenario, how do you think stars would issue new planets?
Yeah, so it's basically so the payment would be out of band. So basically, there are kind of a couple different arrangements that you can envision. One is star just trust the planet, right? Like if Talon's running some stars, like I don't think we would need more than that. Talon's we're above board U.S. company, right? Like we're not just going to steal money from you. And I think people would be fine with that. Now, maybe not. Maybe they want to go through an escrow service of some kind, right? So you could build a digital escrow service. Actually, this is one thing I should mention is from talking to Tacrite Sockripe about this yesterday. He was pointing out that one of the really important things is that we always need to be able to do interop with other markets. And I think you might know more about this than me, but I think the primary thing we would need there is the ability to do an atomic swap from sort of our chain to somebody else's chain.
Yep.
And I think that we would mostly what we would need there is the idea of like a hash time lock contract, so that we could essentially lock up an Urbit address until either something that satisfies the hash is posted, or the time expires. And that, and I mean, maybe we also need some concept of like, doing that in such a way that then, if the hash is satisfied, then that address transfers to a different key, right? And I think that, so basically, like, we need to be able to do our half of an atomic swap with some other chain in such a way that effectively we can say, okay, this asset is currently being held somewhere else, right? It's currently locked up, held somewhere else. And then now, in order to do that, we have to have a consistent notion of time, right? I think that's also worth thinking about, right? This is something that kind of Bitcoin or any blockchain will give you, right? It's a way of agreeing on time, among other things. And so we have to be careful that, that the way we agree on time is sound. So that's something to think through. Could just be that, maybe you rely on Zod's time,
Yeah. Or whoever's ordering, or it's putting a timestamp on things.
Yeah, when I say Zod, I just mean the orderer. I just use Zod as shorthand for that. I don't know. What do you think about this?
Well, I think your long-term vision is correct, and I think that's also the only way in which the Urbit community itself can sort of stay sane in terms of public key infrastructure.
Oh yeah.
Otherwise, somebody will disagree with it. Like this, it doesn't matter if there's it doesn't matter what external chain it is. Somebody's not going to like it. Somebody wants their own chain or their own pet project, right? So long term, it probably should be. I think a stepped approach is interesting, but could have odd complications like time-locked contracts and other things. Though, jumping all in with both feet is also quite scary. So I don't know that we'd want to try to do that either.
Right.
More short-term, I could see things like, so the nice thing about something like a proof of authority side chain would be we could do some of this stuff in a stepwise fashion with some of the same dynamics that you sort of described.
Yeah.
Meaning like the validators are galaxies. They're running in sort of an internal blockchain. It's a data structure that's not native to Urbit, but it's still, the trust model is the same, or at least roughly similar. You could even tweak the source code somewhat. And then possibly with doing it that way, you could get some of these stepwise things where we're removing the dependencies on a blockchain data structure and moving them more towards an internal state in an application that just runs on the network. But I think I'm also similar to you. Like, I think I want to hear what other people think. I want to weigh the pros and cons. But I do think anything that we come up with is likely, I think there's likely going to be a lot of pain to suffer through now. Like, we can't really do anything super fast. Like, we do have to sort of think about this.
I mean, anything we do, we have to really make sure it works.
Yeah, and we're still in sort of the ideation phase. Like, we're just still thinking through the options. And so I think really talking about moving anywhere is premature, but I would like to be thinking about social structures like the Senate, and the way you described it is actually very similar to the way I think about it. As a parliamentary body that has its own rules and regulations that can be somewhat flexible about how it does things and responsive, and has expertise. Like, I think that's what we do have with our galaxies, and that's getting better over time. And some of those structures are getting booted right now, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm happy to see that. I've noticed there's been more of that the past few months. I mean, there's been some of it for a long time, but it's nice to see that accelerate.
So I guess maybe what really needs to happen, right, is those galaxies, because they're kind of the last. They're the ones that have to sort of make some of this stuff happen. So they should probably get together sooner rather than later. That's probably what needs to happen, and maybe with some presentations similar to what you just did.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that basically, like, I mean, I feel confident that Talon will be able to come to some consensus about what the next step should be, and that basically we should kind of present that to the galaxies and see what they think, and because I mean, we've been thinking about this for a while already.
Yeah, I think a lot of that sounds pretty rational.
It's interesting what you mentioned about the sidechain, about like you could get some of the benefits of just kind of like a self-hosted environment, but while keeping some of the benefits of Ethereum, and especially the fact that there's, what was it, XDAI, is that what you said?
Yeah, XDAI is a sidechain. So in that particular example, if we moved there, that's not like self-sovereign, meaning it's moving to proof of stake, and so it would just be whoever has the most stake at the moment would be the ones validating, you know, that kind of thing. But that's not to say, I mean, it's open source, so you could potentially fork the thing and do something very similar.
Is the idea there that somebody could either submit a transaction on that sidechain or directly to the main chain in Ethereum?
Well, there's a bridge, and so you have that, and the bridges are typically managed by the validators, but on both sides of the sort of the you know, so they have a smart contract on the Ethereum side and smart contract on the side chain, and then when you deposit your asset there, it moves and vice versa, but you pay for only one direction, and then the validator pays for the other, that kind of thing. So once you move it into like the cheap version of Ethereum, which is XDAI, you know, everything internally there is paid in a stable currency, DAI.
Do you know how many validators they use on the Ethereum side, the main chain side?
Well, you mean on XDAI?
Yeah.
So right now they're selling stake, which is the staking token, and you need like $75,000 worth of it in order to be a validator. Okay. I think they launched with something like 6 validators, which is why it's so fast, right? Because it's proof of authority. So it'll probably go up into the 20s or 30s, maybe potentially more.
Yeah. I was noticing reading through a number of these other consensus protocols that there seems to be some sort of sweet spot in like the, you know, couple dozen to 100 or so validator nodes. That seems to be like, there seems to be something where people don't usually go beyond that. Yeah. Which is, it was interesting to see that, because like thinking, all right, well, that's, you know, galaxies are sort of like roughly the right number then. Yeah. It's interesting. Okay, so I'll have to read more about how XDAI works. Think about that. So you said that there's this bridge. So basically, like only the validators can submit transactions to the Ethereum chain from the sidechain. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Or any anyone with, well, you can have multiple bridges, right? But if you deposit your asset into a smart contract that has it's like a wormhole to the other, you can't use different bridges, but or it's like a bridge, right? You can go over one bridge, you can come back the same one, but you can't use a different one.
Oh, I see. So basically, if the same bridge, meaning the same validator, or just the same set of validators?
Well, actually, technically, it really depends on what the authority is. So if the validators were both the same and it's technically 2 different contracts, it would work. But that's sort of neither here nor there. It's like, so if you move it into a smart contract on XDAI, and that contract moves it to Ethereum, but that Ethereum contract has no authority over the Ethereum asset, it won't work, right? So let's use number or letters. So Ethereum contract A maps to XDAI contract B, and Ethereum contract C maps to XDAI contract D, right? Okay, so if I move from A to B, and then I move that token to B, I can't move it back to C because A owns that asset, not C.
I see. So basically, you're using it uses the Ethereum chain for like join points among the various side.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm asking, I'm wondering about something I think a little bit different, which is like can state updates flow from the main chain to the side chain, or only from the side chain back to the main chain?
I think so, and because I think the bridge can do arbitrary messages, so that can include state into the virtual machine of the other. But I think what you're asking is, can that go bidirectional? And I don't know. I don't know about that. But I want to say yes because the EVMs are the same, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not they're using the same kind of computational model, I'm not sure that would be the determining factor there. I think it would have to do with like what kind of synchronization they're doing.
Meaning, is it valid? Valid state.
Yeah, or like, is there some way that they can prevent like a attempted change on the main chain and an attempted change on the side chain from clobbering each other, from conflicting?
It depends, I suppose, on the contract. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll have to read about it to get the full answer there.
Cool.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's like an intermediate solution too, basically, where you have like an official Ethereum sidechain, or have an Ethereum sidechain, but then like transfer management of that to like a Galaxy vote, something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
They could even run the nodes. I mean, that's how they would do it. They would run the nodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess like I'm wondering if if there's a sort of different pathway there that involves sort of like where basically instead of sort of taking layer by layer of the Urbit address space off of Ethereum into self-hosting, instead of doing that, we would like just move the whole thing into a side chain, but then have like Urbit take over sort of more and more responsibilities of that side chain until eventually maybe like the sort of cross posting onto Ethereum, onto the Ethereum main chain is like maybe only done for atomic swaps, or like basically sort of take that side chain and sort of tease it apart slowly over time from the main one. Now that's a vague thought, so it might not translate to actual code, but but it's something that hadn't occurred to me until just now. So
cool. All right, thanks for coming on, Ted. I appreciate it, and I think the rest of the community will be interested to see this. So once it's ready, I'll push it out, and hopefully people can get educated on this topic.
Yeah, feel free to educate me also. I've been attempting to do so.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Good to talk to you.
You too, man. Bye.